One of the big takeaways from the Modi-Trump bilateral was the US offer of F-35 fighter jets. The F-35 is a fifth-generation stealth fighter renowned for its ability to operate undetected at supersonic speeds. Will this prove to be a game-changer for the Indian Air Force? And more importantly, is India willing to buy these pricey fighters from America?
Big boost to India-US defense ties. The Donald Trump administration has offered to sell the F-35 fighter stealth fighter jets to India. F-35 Lightning II fighter jet is a fifth-generation stealth fighter renowned for its ability to operate undetected at supersonic speeds.
Starting this year, we'll be increasing military sales to India by many billions of dollars. We're also paving the way to ultimately provide India with the F-35 stealth fighters.
The United States is aiming at increasing military supplies to India.
भारत की डिफेंस प्रिपेयर्डनेस में अमेरिका की महत्वपूर्ण भूमिका है। स्ट्रैटेजिक और ट्रस्टेड पार्टनर के नाते हम जॉइंट डेवलपमेंट, जॉइंट प्रोडक्शन और ट्रांसफर ऑफ टेक्नोलॉजी की दिशा में सक्रिय रूप से आगे बढ़ रहे हैं। आने वाले समय में भी नई टेक्नोलॉजी और इक्विपमेंट हमारी क्षमता बढ़ाएंगे।
This proposal has sparked significant interest in New Delhi. India is yet to take the final call on Trump's proposal.
There is, in most cases, a request for proposals that is floated. There are responses to those. They are evaluated. I don't think with regard to the acquisition of an advanced aviation platform by India, that process has started as yet. So,
the Foreign Secretary clarified that the offer has been made by the US, but Indian Air Force will follow due process based on its air staff requirements, and a request for proposal is yet to be floated. F-35 fighter jet can be a game changer for air superiority with its advanced capabilities. US F-35 is the most lethal, survivable and connected stealth fighter which can operate at undetected supersonic speed. The fighter jet features cutting-edge avionics and a center fusion, making it superior to China's J-35A. But multiple questions remain, from the cost to the overall integration with the Russian and French systems, from S-400 missile defense systems to Su-30 MKI and the French Rafales. With Shivani Sharma, Bureau Report, India Today.
Does it make sense for India to buy the F-35 fighter jet, even if there's a long runway to actually get there? Or is it just too costly? And therefore, given that we've already invested in the Rafale fighter jet system, this is not something India should be looking at. Joining us for perspective, I have Brahma Chalani, one of India's leading strategic affairs experts. With us also on this broadcast is Pramit Pal Chaudhary, head of India practice at the Eurasia Group. I want to go across to Brahma first. Brahma, given the options on the table and the fact that the Indian Air Force Chief has publicly now spoken of the fact that we're running horribly behind schedule in terms of augmenting our fighter aircraft fleet, would you be looking at the F-35 as a relevant purchase for the Indian Air Force? Or do you think it's too costly, we can't trust the Americans, therefore we shouldn't think about it?
Well, first, the F-35 is still not on offer. Trump said ultimately it'll be offered to India. Ultimately means in the years to come. More importantly, we should not forget that India is today the world's largest arms importer. India alone makes up about 10% of the global trade in arms. This is a huge burden on the Indian economy. Weapons imports, and oil and gas imports. These two are weighing India down. And I think the larger question that we need to ask ourselves is that in today's world, the main threats nations are facing, especially India, if you can look at the threats that India has faced since the turn of the century, since the Kargil War, these threats have been essentially unconventional in nature. Buying conventional weapon systems that cost a fortune, does that enhance India's security? Now, that's a more fundamental question, because we have been investing so heavily in major conventional weapon systems that we have not done the basic thing, which is to upgrade our border security. Without border security, there can be no national security. If you look at all the problems that India has faced in the last 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, these problems have arisen because of lack of adequate border security. We need to do our basics. And I think investing more and more in conventional weapon systems, especially ones that are so costly, is something that we need to consider very carefully before investing more and more resources.
That's an important point to make, especially given the fact that on the battlefield between Russia and Ukraine, it's really the Russian infantry versus Ukraine armed drones. And if that's the nature of the battle, then do we really need to spend so much money on buying these F-35s? I want to go across to Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam. He's flown the MiG-21, he's flown the Mirage 2000s, he's a leading strategic analyst, military historian. Air Marshal Subramaniam, you know, as a fighter pilot and from your lens, and you understand what the Indian Air Force lacks and needs, is it relevant for India to be thinking seriously about the offer made by the American president to eventually buy these F-35s? Or do you think it's a fancy toy, but that's not what we need?
So, thank you, Rahul, for having me on the show. Two things first here. As far as the clear and present danger for the Indian Air Force is its rapidly depleting offensive assets. And when I talk about offensive assets, I mean to say fighter squadrons, 30 and still going down. Is there a need for building conventional capability in today's context? I think I differ with Brahma over here. As long as the national strategic establishment suggests that India faces full spectrum threats that spread across the spectrum from the conventional spectrum to sub-conventional conflict, I think India has no choice but to continue building conventional capability, albeit with greater technology and greater emphasis on making leaner force structures. Now, as far as the F-35 is concerned, I think it's too early for the Indian Air Force to actually respond to this offer. And here I agree with Brahma that it's not really an offer as yet. The Indian Air Force would be very keenly watching as to what the fine print of the offer is. Please keep in mind that 19 Air Forces are already flying the F-35. Delivery schedules are on the line for each one of these countries. None of these countries have managed transfer of technology as far as the F-35 is concerned. There is no doubt that it's a state-of-the-art platform. And should the platform come into the Indian Air Force's inventory, it would be a huge fillip to the Indian Air Force's offensive capability. But having said that, let's get real. Let the offer come in. Let's see what's the fine print. What is TOT? Is there any element of indigenization? Are production lines going to be set up in India? Is the F-35 going to be a harbinger of things to come, in the sense, would it offer a platform for collaboration between the United States and India for a sixth generation fighter? These are the kind of issues that are extremely important to mull over before one can, go
sure,
to the
those are the
rooftop
technical details, but just from a fighter pilot's lens, for our viewers to understand the differences between flying an F-35 versus the Rafales which we've just bought, the Chinese stealth fighters which are now out and making a lot of headlines, and the Russian stealth fighter, which could potentially also be an alternative if India is indeed looking to buy these stealth fighter jets.
Yeah, so, on that aspect, certainly, considering that on the Tibetan plateau, the PLAF has deployed, wide-ranging air defense radars, having a stealth fighter to penetrate those defenses is extremely vital. The second element is that of super cruise. And Super Cruise is the ability to, the Super Cruise is the ability to fly at top speeds and be unobservable at speeds below supersonic speeds. So if one talks about technology, pure integration of weapon systems and sensors, the F-35 is par excellence. Can be integrated into our already complex fighter ecosystem that has Jaguars, Mirages, MiG-29, Sukhoi 30s, and the Rafale. That's the question to look at.
That's an important point. Pramit Pral Chaudhary, we already have Russian fighter jets. We have now French fighter jets, new and old. And now if we go and introduce an American line, the question also of interoperability, given the fact that we've got S-400 missile defense systems from Russia, just the complications are, is it just too much of a hornet's nest to try and unpack, or do you think it's worth the effort in the long term? Pramit.
The long-term problem that we will face is Russia. Russia's aerospace industry is dying. And the problem that we're facing increasingly is that they're dependent more and more on Chinese components, which is something unacceptable to India. That's one of the reasons we've been having difficulties, for example, with S-400 shipments, is that where does Russia get its semiconductor chips from? And that same problem exists with almost all of its advanced weaponry systems, is that the Western sanctions means there is no chip supplier other than China, and this is now spreading across the Russian defense system. This means that Russia effectively cannot provide, not because we have a bad relationship with Russia, but because Russia simply doesn't have the capacity in electronics to provide for a lot of these new advanced weapon systems, and without working or living with a Chinese supply chain behind it, this is simply unacceptable for us. And that's one of the reasons we're canceling or slowly walking away from them. So we are really looking, I would argue, for a Sukhoi replacement in the long term. In the short term, I don't think that's a problem at all. But in the long term, that is going to be an issue. Hence the F-35, the Rafale, and so on, we're looking at. Now, what is the F-35's advantage? The number one advantage is, of course, that it is the only operational fifth-generation fighter, a full-scale fifth-generation fighter in the world. The Chinese have the J-20 and the J-35, but they are not full fifth-generation fighters. They're underpowered, and they are still visible under radar in certain circumstances. If China succeeds in building a full-scale fifth-generation fighter, the problem that we will face is that almost all of our top-end fighters will become obsolete against it. Technologically, they will fall far behind.
How far is China from being able to build a fully fifth-generation fighter aircraft which avoids radar signals and is completely undetectable by Indian assets and Indian radar assets?
Correct, and more importantly, our fighters, the Rafale or the Sukhois, will not be able to lock onto this as a target. There have been games where the Americans have pitched their fourth generation against fifth generation fighters, and the problem is simply that the fourth generation fighters can't see the fifth generation. In other words, they can even visually see it, but their radars cannot lock onto it, in which case they cannot fire their missiles. So this is the problem. That's why the generation shift is so important. So that's why a fifth generation fighter at some point will probably have to be part of our weapons mix. And the game is deciding when and how. I personally have my doubts about the Russian fifth generation fighter. From what I understand, Russia can make a fighter that flies like a fifth generation fighter, but it cannot see like a fifth generation fighter. The French have a problem that they need somebody to support them in terms of financing. You mentioned the cost. Actually, the unit cost of an F-35 is much lower than Rafale, not because it's a cheaper aircraft. It's just that they've made over 1,000 of them. So the unit cost of an F-35 versus a Rafale C, which is a standard class we would be buying, the Rafale C is only less than 300 are in operation. So the unit cost automatically rises simply because the sheer production numbers are so much higher. But a fifth generation fighter's life cycle cost is much higher. But as I said, we may unfortunately have the necessity of having to go fifth generation at some point simply because our primary strategic adversary, China, is so close now to a operational.
Those are important points by Pramit Pal Chaudhary, because the big purchase right now is whether we buy more Rafale fighter jets Air Marshal Subramaniam, or whether we expand it to looking at an F-15, F-18, F-16++, from the United States. An opinion there is very sharply divided, as you know. Where do you come out on this question of we need more
I think,
fighter jets, which ones should we get?
So, I think it's unfair. I think it's unfair to put the Air Force in a spot to choose between the F-35 and the MRFA, for which the global tender is already out. I think the more urgent requirement is to ensure that India's stock of 4.5 generation fighters is able to, you're able to stock up your Rafale class, or you're able to stock up a 4.5 generation aircraft to tide over the immediate crisis, which is, I think, over the next decade or so. But I fully agree with Pramit Pal Chaudhary that I think we can't stay behind in the race for a 5th generation fighter. The AMCA has been unveiled the other day, but I really wonder, given the kind of schedules that HAL has been maintaining, what is the kind of timeline that we're looking at the AMCA when it comes to a 5th generation aircraft? So I think at some point in time, we will have to look at a 5th generation aircraft. But for heaven's sake, at this point in time, don't ask the Indian Air Force to choose between an F-35 and another 4.5 generation fighter, because what it needs is to beef up those 36 Rafales in the short to medium term.
And there, Brahmacharan, both the other guests seem to be disagreeing with your position, because your argument is that you don't really need these very expensive fighter jets. What you need, for example, whether they are drones or to be able to deal with your border situation. But the fact is, as the Russia-Ukraine battlefield shows, the nature of warfare is changing so rapidly. And I was reading a report that these drones get better every few weeks. Ukraine is able to improve the quality of the drone. So is that really the conversation you think we should be having? Or do you think they're incomparable? Brahmachalani.
Well, there are two things. First, as you rightly point out, the Ukraine war is showing the nature of air power is changing. In the Ukraine war, missiles and drones have proved critical. Nobody's going to give India ballistic missiles or cruise missiles. In that area, we are self-sufficient. But do you know how much we spend annually on our missile program? It's only a few $100 million a year. Compare that with the billions of dollars we sink every year in buying conventional weapon systems from overseas. Why not strengthen your missile program? Why not strengthen your drone capabilities? Even a country like North Korea, or take the case of Iran, these two countries are the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world. And look at their advances in missile and drone capabilities. Iran just a couple of days ago released a video of a new underwater drone system. They showed the launch of it from underwater. Such capabilities we need to develop at home. But there's a more important thing that we tend to forget. India, by and large, imports far more than it exports.
Sure.
And apart from the US, with which we have a trade surplus, India has a large trade deficit with the rest of the world. And that trade deficit is weighing down India's economy, along with oil imports, arms imports. These two items are weighing India down economically. Now,
Brahmachalani, Air Marshal Subramaniam, and Pramit Pal Chaudhary for joining us with your thoughts. Thank you very much. That's a much larger debate. Should we look at an F-35 or any fighter jet at all, or should we instead be looking at more missile systems, more drones, armed drones? Because that's really where the nature of warfare is changing, and changing at an extremely rapid pace. How did this bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and American President Donald Trump go from the lens of the officials in the Ministry of External Affairs? I'm joined now by Meera Shankar. She's been India's ambassador to the United States, a very well-known Indian diplomat. Ma'am, would this have been very tricky for Messrs. Misri and our ambassador Quatra in the United States to manage the fact that you've got a big Trump press conference on tariffs happening when your boss is in DC He continuously targets India as being a tariff abuser. Was this really what you'd call a diplomatic nightmare in terms of putting together a state visit?
I think by now people are more used to Mr. Trump's methods. So, he generally steps up the pressure before a meeting and strengthens his negotiating position. It's like Sun Tzu's winning without warfare if you step up the pressure. So he psychologically tries to put the other side at a disadvantage or to soften them up before the meeting. I think
how did the meeting go from your lens? You've seen the first Trump-Modi bilateral, the US meeting, the India meeting, you saw the Modi-Biden meeting. How do you compare them?
Well, I think there's greater ideological affinity between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump because they are both heading conservative parties and their domestic agendas to some extent have similarities. So you saw that in the first term of President Trump. Now, in his second term, he's come back with a stronger mandate with very few checks and balances on his executive authority. And whatever he has promised to do, he has started off doing from day one with a vengeance. So in some sense, this was a more difficult, more unpredictable meeting between the two. And for India, I think the challenge was to avoid the minefields and to keep the big picture in mind and get a sense of how Trump in his second avatar sees the future trajectory of the India-US relationship to try to
we've got just about a month and a half to go before the reciprocal tariffs kick in. Ms. Shankar, do you think that's enough time to be able to get a bilateral trade agreement going, or is there just too little time and way too many complications to actually arrive at a consensus?
See, there are two things. One is that the reciprocal tariffs will kick in April. But on the other hand, the two sides have agreed to discuss on a possible trade deal. And that trade deal, they want to get ready by the fall. So you're looking at two deadlines. If the negotiations are going reasonably well, I take it that the tariffs could be held in abeyance to give time for the trade talks to, reach fruition. If the trade talks are not going well, then you have the possibility of the tariffs kicking in. But I think what the two sides have done is to take what could have been a potential friction point and to deal with it pragmatically. Of course, President Trump also raising issues of agricultural tariffs in India, saying that the US has an average tariff of 2% on agricultural imports, whereas India has an average tariff of 39%.
No, but that's an unviable ask. Prime Minister Modi has, I know the next election is only Bihar, but that's like a political landmine. He steps on it. Mamata Banerjee, Akhilesh, Rahul Gandhi will have their bazookas out for the Prime Minister. He can't mess around with agriculture and dairy tariffs.
I don't think that India will agree. That's what I'm saying. But we can buy a couple of agricultural products like we do buy almonds, pistachios, or even wine. Sometimes Washington apples and so on. So that is something we can do. But like the US was wanting to export beef at one stage, and we had to literally say that this is something which is culturally just not acceptable. You don't understand the Indian context, but no government in India will be able to agree to this. And similarly on agriculture as a whole, we have consistently taken the view that this is a political no-no. We have subsistence farming, 2.5 acre farms. You cannot expose the vulnerability of those farmers to international competition with these huge mega agricultural corporations.
Okay.
So agriculture is a no-no. But again, as I said, there are skillful workarounds, if you will, where you can pick up
taking out time and joining us. You're saying buy what you don't really face massive political backlash around. Maybe we can just reduce Harley-Davidson import duty substantially, make it as close to zero, let them export as many Harleys as they want. Let's see how many Indians actually want to buy it. He somehow got stuck on Harley-Davidsons, and it just keeps coming up in every press conference. Well, some of this is just having to deal with the neighborhood bully. You have to figure out how to trapeze your way around his demands.